This talk is about a complementizer in Dutch, the word om. And it's an optional complementizer, so you see examples here. So in Dutch, if you have a two infinitival complement, it can optionally be preceded by the complementizer om. So really, these examples, even if you ask native speakers, they really don't see differences in acceptability between those two examples here. So it seems to be really optional. Nevertheless, I was interested in seeing if I say, even if it's optional, can we find features, say lexical, syntactic or semantic features that would predict the presence or absence of om in examples like this? And one particular case I want to look at today is the interaction of this phenomenon with fill-a-gap dependency. So if there is a gap in the infinitival complement, how does that affect the choice for leaving out om or not? So it seems to be the received wisdom is this is generally okay, but if you look at actual corpus data, you find that this hardly ever occurs. So this complementizer, so these two infinitival complements occur with governors that can be either a verb, an adjective, a noun, or a verb taking a prepositional complement, where om is usually present if the governor is a noun, about 50% of the time present if it's an adjective, and about 25% of the time present if it's a verb. So there are some differences there. In a dissertation on historical linguistics, the development of this construction was described. So Iberman notes that om originally was only used as a preposition, right, in older Dutch texts. Later it developed into a complementizer where initially it was only used as a complementizer to introduce adjunct clauses, so purpose and goal adjunct clauses, right, not complements. And only around 1750 she finds the first examples where om is actually being used to introduce complements. And here are our friends from descriptive grammar again. So in an interesting and entertaining paper by Frank Janssen, unfortunately it's in Dutch, he goes over a bunch of recent descriptive grammars of Dutch and notes that, say, in the last 2 centuries, there seems to have been a debate about whether the use of om in this situation was actually okay or not, where some grammarians have argued against this, and others have taken a more neutral standpoint. So particularly interesting is, for instance, the Dictionary of Dutch, which took over 100 years to complete. You know, it's this huge 25-volume or so thing. So in 1896, when they reached the word om, right, they argued against the use of om in these complement clauses, and 60 years later, when they reached the word te, and they had to discuss this expression again, they took a more neutral stance. Huh? And even in the 70s, you find people arguing against the use of om in these cases, and even the ANS, say the latest descriptive grammar of Dutch, states that leaving out om makes a formal impression, and that om is more present in spoken language and, say, more informal. And that distinction, I think, at least I don't have it, and nobody I ask still has this intuition. So that seems to have gone completely. So how did I get involved in this issue? Well, I was reading stuff on English optional complementizers, actually. So as you all know, in English, right, we have the complementizer that, which is also optional. This has been well studied, and people have observed that, say, syntactic complexity plays a role. A bunch of features like the distance between the governor and the complement clause, frequency effects, complexity of the embedded subject, all these things play a role. What interested me especially was in work by Roland. So he observes that, of course, if you know the governing verb, you can make a pretty good prediction about whether that will be present or not. So he expresses, or they express that as the that bias. So the number of times a governor occurs with a complement clause with that, divided by the cases where it occurs without that. And so interestingly, so Florian Jäger was giving a talk in Groningen, tutorial on statistics. I was sort of lost after 5 minutes, but one of his cases was this that omission, and that sort of triggered me. So he sort of suggested that, so part of that variation can be explained by observing how often a verb occurs with a complement clause at all, right? So divide that by the number of cases where it occurs without a complement clause. So this is sort of interesting because to get such statistics, you need detailed, syntactically annotated tree banks, right? Because otherwise, so trying to do this on the basis of part of speech tags alone will give you very inaccurate results, right? And I thought, okay, for Dutch, it's easy for me to get that kind of statistics. So if that helps me to predict this variation, that would be fun. So here's the corpus data I used. So a big newspaper corpus automatically annotated, a corpus of spoken data, partially automatically annotated, partially manually corrected. We used the Dutch parser, Alpino parser, so an HPSD parser for Dutch to parse these corpora. And the output of that, that's for reasons, say for project reasons, for tree banking reasons, is a kind of dependency structure. So that looks something like this. So for the cases without OM, and like this for the cases with OM. So it's just enough to figure out the phrasal structure of a clause and the dependency relations within a clause. And that's often exactly what you want for this type of corpus study. And it's also the kind of thing that you can learn student assistants to annotate and to do tree banking, right? So that's why we use this. So one of the things, for instance, that's very easy to confirm is that OM is indeed more frequent in spoken language than in written language. So the blue bars here are the frequency of those verbs with OM in the spoken corpus. The red bars are the frequency of the same verbs in the written corpus, right? So I needed to have verbs which occur with sufficiently often in both corpora. There are not too many of those, but in all cases, in the spoken corpus, OM is present more often. This correlation suggested by Jaeger, if that would be true, you would find lots of spots here, say in the left upper corner, and lots of spots down there in the right lower corner, right? There should be sort of a down-going correlation here. That I can't find in my data. Right? Maybe I didn't model things right, but at least the way I naively tried to model that did not work out. So to summarize this part of the research, right? So using corpus data, you can find that about 25% of the time we have OM, if the verb's a governor. Of course, knowing the verb is a very strong predictor for whether OM is present or not. And then there are a bunch of features which are borrowed from this work on English, that omission, which you can also apply to Dutch, say. And so all these measures for syntactic complexity, they do play a role. You can show it's statistically significant, also because of lots of data that usually works out. But the effects are really small, right? I also try to use semantic features. So the idea is that OM is obligatory if it's an adjunct clause. So if I have something that could also easily be interpreted as an adjunct clause, I would suspect OM to be present more often. That's true, but only to a very limited extent. So this part of the research sort of left me frustrated, right? So it seemed, yeah, I could do something, but my results were far less convincing than what I'd seen people do and report for English, right? So when I was sort of expressing this frustration to colleagues, and then I think it was Jack Hoeksema who said, well, have you looked at the interaction of, say, presence or absence of OM and fill-a-gap dependencies? And, well, my first reaction was, you're never going to find that in corpora. On the other hand, I thought it is kind of interesting, right? Because we do know that, you know, fill-a-gap dependencies can interact with things like, for instance, presence of that in English as well, right? So he sort of suggested that if we have a fill-a-gap dependency where the gap is inside the infinitival complement, then maybe OM will be absent, right? So he suggested almost like some kind of island constraint. That's sort of interesting because I thought, yeah. So Ivan, I think, was one of the first people who sort of mentioned to me, I grew up with all these island constraints that just hardwired and absolute, and your grammar framework should better make sure that you account for these island constraints. And Ivan was always saying, well, maybe they're not absolute. And look, there's people, if you change these examples in this way and that way, they become much better. So maybe it's not part of the grammar, right? Maybe it's processing. So since I was interested in, you know, the idea that presence or absence of OM has something to do with processing, it's at least worth trying to look into this. But the problem, of course, is that, you know, it's beautiful. We have beautiful tree banks, just like Tsuneko and Erhard were using. But I thought, you know, these long-distance dependencies, that's, you know, something linguists like to play with. They never occur in real data, right? And I also soon learned that our parser, accurate as it is not very accurate in cases like this. So, but first, what's the perceived wisdom on this? So I didn't find any papers discussing this explicitly, but I found a few papers where it's sort of mentioned in passing. So Bennis just notes these things as okay. Extraction out of a complement clause where OM is present. So paper by Brookhouse and others, they also give this example, but there they note that the complementizer is preferably dropped. So they seem to have this intuition that it's not so easy with OM. So how could I test it using my corpus data? I mean, a lot of this type of research involves human subjects and reading times or eye movements and that sort of stuff. I only have corpus data. So will I be able to show anything about whether OM can be present or not? Well, we can maybe try to look in relative clauses, right? And if we're lucky, we find enough non-local dependencies. So this is the sort of sobering slide. I was looking at 15,000 relative clauses, and over 70% of the time the dependencies is local, right? And even more so if you look at the right bar, it's usually very local. So in the local cases, 70% of the time, the gap corresponds to the subject, right? So here's your relative pronoun, here's your subject gap, right? It's very local, okay? But there's a small residue of non-local cases, right? So, but that's not good enough because I was interested in a very specific type of non-local or relative clause, namely relative clauses with a gap in a two infinitival complement. And because the parsers did so bad, I restricted attention to object gaps, right? Gaps corresponding to a missing object in the infinitival complement. So cases like this. So I had collected tree-bank data of, say, 285,000 sentences containing such an infinitival complement. In those 285,000 sentences, there are 22,000 sentences where there is a relative that contains this infinitival complement. That's not too bad. But then out of those 22,000 cases, 70,000 cases are local dependencies, so I'm still not where I want to be. And I'm left with about 4,000 cases where the dependencies is non-local, right? But that's all but this is automatically parsed data, right? So it includes all kinds of noise. So I zoomed in on the object gaps. I extracted about 1,500 cases. I manually went through all of them. And I was left with about 849 cases, right? And these are all the cases with OM in them, right? This slide and this slide, where the last four ones are all from the same article, right? So this is really, really rare. Whereas on the other hand, cases without OM are relatively frequent, so those are all the other cases. And I should add, the cases with OM, they do sound perfectly grammatical to me, right? It's not as if they're somehow ill-formed, they're just very infrequent. So this does suggest that indeed, if there is a non-local filler gap dependency with a gap inside the infinitival clause, we can predict the absence of OM with high accuracy. On the other hand, since it's such a tiny portion of my data, it will not help me improve my general model, right? But nevertheless, it's sort of interesting to do this. And since I had to go through all these cases manually, I also observed that some verbs occur far more frequently in this construction than in the general data set, right? So an extreme case is the verb achten, to consider, to be supposed to, which occurs with sentences like this, where the first sentence seemed to be appropriate for me on this day. And something else you can note here, that they're all cases, they're all passives, right? So it seems to, I think you can only use achten in this sense with an infinitival complement in passive clauses. And for some reason that facilitates these long distance extractions. I have no idea why that is, but this is a clear sort of collocational effect. So to conclude, and to just repeat the conclusions of Erhard and Tsuneko, right? So what I've shown about OM is that, the lexical item is a real strong predictor for whether we will see OM or not. And furthermore, the study of these filler gap dependencies shows that if you have such a long distance dependency, OM is almost always absent. And there are actually collocational effects in these constructions, right? Something I hadn't anticipated. And so the nice thing is we can do this kind of work to repeat Erhard's words, right? because we have detailed annotated, large, automatically annotated corpora. And you need large corpora because you want to search for real rare phenomena, such as relative clauses with non-local dependencies, which is rare, involving a specific clausal complement, which is even rarer, involving a specific verbal head, which almost never occurs. So to conclude this talk, I want to end with one last slide, and that's to say that Ivan over the years was a very frequent visitor in Groningen on all kinds of occasions, sometimes even cooking for us, which was always very enjoyable. So lots of people in Groningen wanted to say hello, so this is my final slide. Thank you.
A few minutes for comments, questions.
So I've been looking at the construction where the infinitival 2 in English is optional. And one thing that I found is that I hadn't looked at when I was looking at that, that seems to play a role as prosody. And so it might be something to look at. That my guess is probably that the ohm is unstressed, the same way that infinitival 2 is always unstressed. And look to see whether it's more likely to be missing if the two syllables on either side of it are stressed.
That's something our tree banks don't have. But maybe the spoken corpora.
But you can, you can just look at the lexical stress on the words. That's probably in some kind of online dictionary.
Yes. Maybe that's good enough.
You can get that information.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, maybe I missed this, but did you present a chorus? So your finding was that there was a very small rate of ohm use in the non-local, but basically like the non-local unbounded dependencies. But did you also, what was the results for local unbounded dependencies? Like, subject extractions.
I didn't look at, so you mean where the gap is not inside the infinitival complement, but you can't have directly the
so what's the compare? I guess what's the comparison case? I mean, is the result that it's just that it's rare, or?
So yes. So you have a relative pronoun, right? Then a finite clause that contains the governing selecting verb, right? And then embedded the two infinitival clause. And there I hope to find a gap. Right? And if there is a gap, ohm is absent. That's or almost.
Oh, wait. And so if there's no gap, then?
Then the gap is in the higher clause,
Right,
the matrix
rate?
clause.
What's the rate?
It's not on your own though. The gap isn't on.
No, but one could have done a comparison.
But it could still play a role.
Well, it would be interesting to know what the comparison is. And I guess the other question sort of relating to that is, do you have any sense of whether, so when you're using automatically parsed data to ask this kind of question, there's a question as to whether the presence of the structure in the sentence affects the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake in parsing the sentence and correctly getting, for example, correctly identifying the unbounded dependency.
Yeah. No, that's why I went through it manually, right? So that's the disappointing part. I think about 50% of the extracted corpus data was the false hit. So I had something like 15, 16.
Rule out false positives, but you also have problems with false negatives, right? Where the parser just didn't allow you to recover the structure at all. It's not that the parser was overzealous.
I didn't want to go through these 200.
The other way around by taking a couple of hundred that that you know unambiguously that the structure is one or the other, and that do and don't have the ohm, and then just looking at parse accuracy on those.
No, we also manually corrected email data, so we could easily use that to verify that.
You could use the examples from within the hand parse part of the train bank, the tree bank, and cross validate.
Yes.